Hi everyone, welcome to Turn of the Century 1900, Hope and Despair. So our title has two functions. One, the turn of the century portion, gives us the time moving from the Victorian era to the early 20th century, really up into 1914 and the beginning of the First World War. The hope and despair portion of our title gives you some indication about the two sort of opposite ways in which we can interpret this time in history. Many people were very hopeful, very optimistic about the changes that were taking place, about the new technology that was being developed. But then on the other side of things, many people were also very frustrated, very hopeless, despairing of what was to come. They were worried about the future. They were also, upset that the optimism that other people felt, they were unable to take part in some of the positive changes that were taking place. So just a quick overview of what we're going to do. We're going to first talk about some of those technological changes coming out of the Industrial Revolution and what that meant for society and for politics, how those changes affected the social and the political scene. And then when we get a good sense of that, we'll also take a look at the intellectual and cultural changes that are taking place around the turn of the century as well, looking at things like Einstein's discoveries, the theory of relativity, the birth of psychoanalysis and Freudian ideology, as well as looking at art and literature of the time and how we're moving away from more sort of realistic interpretations of what painters are painting and sculptors are sculpting and so forth in the realm of art, but to more abstract types of paintings like the one you see here, which is Edvard Munch's The Scream, which I think you get a pretty good idea of what abstract art is looking like at the time, at the turn of the century. In terms of literature, things going in the opposite direction. Instead of the romantic versions of novels and war narratives and travel narratives and things of that nature, novels tend to move more onto the realistic portion of the world and exposing some of the social ills at the time, becoming more active in seeking out change and reform by using the pen. So first we're going to talk about the Industrial Revolution, which begins in Great Britain in the 1750s, and by the 1850s it spreads to continental Europe and the United States. Britain was ripe for the Industrial Revolution because it had a set of advantages that other countries didn't have at the time. So, for example, it had a stable amount of wealth within the country itself, relatively speaking. It had colonies on which it could have drawn for any raw materials that it didn't have at home, although it had a lot of coal and cotton and things like that at home, the raw materials. But it also had the colonies that it could draw on for those things to supplement what it did not have at home, as well as people. It had the labor force, both within the British Isles, again, and also the labor force in its many colonies around the world. And then finally, it had a stable government at home. It was relatively stable in the fact that, yes, there were changes in government, certainly, but there was a process, a democratic process by which members of parliament and then therefore prime ministers were ruling, of course, in the name of the queen or king, as the case may be. And but generally speaking, when there was a transfer of power, it happened peacefully. This was different than the rest of Europe, where unfortunately they were experiencing many revolutions and war with their neighbors and things of that nature. And so when you're spending all that money, putting down revolutions and or warring with your neighbor, you don't have a lot of money to invest in other things, right? Whereas as Britain had, the money and the time and the raw materials to invest not in just um, into the government, which of course it certainly did, but also to invest in new inventions that made the Industrial Revolution possible. So the second thing we're going to talk about here briefly are just some of the new discoveries, new inventions. For example, steel replacing iron as the chief source of metal, which is more durable, it's more pliable, it's easier to work with, it doesn't break as often, and it's actually easier to fix when something does break than iron. So all of that, made the machinery as well as buildings and things of that nature possible. Of course, we can't forget electricity. Mr. Edison and Mr. Tesla and their contributions to the discovery of electricity certainly makes all the things that run on electricity possible. So later on, the radio, light. So you could have 24-hour cycles of shifts at the factories when you could keep the lights on all day long and all night long, right? And then finally, the internal combustion engine eventually makes room for the horseless buggy or the automobile. We also know that we have the first flight, right? Where supposedly the Wright brothers were the first to do it, although there's a little bit of controversy over that. Both the French, the Chinese, and the Italians all, right around the same time were experimenting with flight, and so that's where the controversy comes into place. But nevertheless, human beings for the first time are able to fly. And this is huge in terms of going into the hope or the optimism that putting man into the sky, allowing man to fly, coming to fruition in the 20th century, in the very early part of the 20th century, provides a lot of great hope for a whole lot of human beings because, as we know, human beings have been trying to fly forever, right? Going back to the ancient Greeks and onward, many different peoples and cultures have tried to experiment with flight and failed. We now have this pinnacle of human achievement, and if man could fly, what other possibilities are out there, right? So this goes to that bit of optimism. Also, not mentioned on the PowerPoint, but mentioned in the textbook, are the great many inventions of medicine, where we start to see, new discoveries in medicine and inventions in medicine, where diseases, there's cures for diseases, or there are treatments for diseases that also give people a great amount of hope. Likewise, improvements in agriculture and farming make it possible to grow more food. More food is more plentiful, more available. Therefore, people are more better nourished. Therefore, they're living longer. So we also have that as a great sense of hope as well. This creates a world economy, not quite on the global scale as today, but certainly there is an interconnectedness through transportation, connecting economies, where ships particularly, they can travel faster than they ever could. They don't have to stop to refuel as often. Eventually, when oil replaces coal as the chief source of fuel, this then allows these ships, and again, back to Great Britain, has the most powerful navy in the world, and so leads the way because of its very nature of controlling the seas, connecting these economies for better or worse. And we know the betterment mostly was due to the betterment of the Europeans, where they become sort of the dominant world global force, right? And to the detriment of those places that were either taken over through colonization or conquest. This also creates a competition amongst the Europeans for colonies, right? So, this idea, this notion that empires are the largest empire, the country that has the most colonies, is the most powerful and therefore is supposedly the best. So next, we're going to talk about societal changes. What are those things that made society change, right? So particularly urbanization, or the growth of cities, really changes quite literally the landscape of most of Europe and again across the pond in the United States as well. So we have these massive cities that grow. For example, Berlin was a city of just a couple thousand people that seemingly overnight, of course not really, but seemingly overnight, grows into a population of almost 1 million. So we have this tremendous growth of cities. Why do the cities grow? Because that's where the jobs are, right? That's where the opportunity is. And, for the first time in human history, you can see people who get the idea, this hope, or this great notion that, what, my father was a potato farmer, and his father before him, and his father before him, and his father before him, and so on and so forth, right? And I don't have to be a potato farmer if I don't want to, right? I can go to the city, I can get a job, I can make decent money, and I don't have to live the same way my family has lived for several generations, back to the dimness of time, supposedly. So there's this tremendous amount of hope because for the first time in human history, people hope to do something different than what's expected of them, right? And the opportunities seemingly are endless, right? Although we know that that's not necessarily true. So cities become very large. Unfortunately, they become overpopulated, and that leads to a lot of the social ills, some of the despair stuff that we will talk about as well. We do see the emergence of a middle class, though, and this changes tremendously the society, which before either you were quite wealthy, you were a landowner, and therefore you were part of the aristocracy, or you were someone who worked the land. You didn't have any land, you didn't have any title, and therefore you didn't have any rights, basically, more or less. So what happens is people who can achieve wealth, they can have money, they can earn money without having to own land. So this middle class is made up of several different groups of people, including, ship magnates, people who own shipping companies earn a lot of money, factory owners earn a lot of money, people who invent things may earn a lot of money because they sell their idea to some manufacturer and they get rich that way. Think Shark Tank, if you will. And so you have this middle class group of people, of merchants who then sell all sorts of consumer goods as well, who may be able to achieve more wealth, again, without having to own any vast estates of land. And And then you also have people who, through education, become part of the middle class. People who, educate themselves and work in sort of service industries, if you will, whether it be in medicine or law, as lawyers or politicians who may, they won't be able, in England, for example, they wouldn't be able to be members of the House of Lords, but they would certainly be able to participate in politics in the House of Commons. So you have this middle class of sort of self-made men, what the French call the nouveau riche, right? Or new money. If you think of perhaps, thinking way back before you were born, that movie Titanic, right? Which is a huge blockbuster, and you can still catch it on TV every now and again. Um, they talked about the fact, you saw the sort of classicism in the different ways, in the different groups of people where they were allowed to even go on that ship, for example. So you have new money, you have old money, and then of course you still have a lot of folks who are poor. But this emergence of middle class, these middle class primarily men, are the ones that are going to start bringing, calling for changes in society, because they're going to say, hey, wait a minute, we've got all this wealth and we contribute to society, so now we should have some rights. And they're going to be the ones that are first going to call for more equitable education. That education should be for everybody, or at least it should be for them, right? It shouldn't be limited to just the upper classes. So through advocating for changes in laws and lobbying and that sort of thing, we do get universal elementary education, which becomes sort of a mainstay of industrialized nations. And what that means is that elementary is right, K through 6, so a 6th grade education. Universal, meaning is guaranteed to everybody, and compulsory, meaning that the government has to provide it. So the government provides a 6th grade education to all of its citizens, all of its children, right? Now, that becomes law, and that's supposed to symbolize progress. And for a lot of people, it is progress. It's certainly a step in the right direction, right? It's not quite, what we have today. Today we have universal 12th grade education. But just as then and now, there are certainly many children who unfortunately fall through the cracks and don't necessarily get that education. So even though it is compulsory, the government has to provide it, it doesn't necessarily mean that every child was getting educated, right? Because there were many, certainly, children who, until the advent of child labor laws, were working in factories and doing work to help support their family, as well as in the rural areas as well. If you needed your child to stay at home and help you tend to, the fields or the animals or both or whatever, they're not going to school, right? So, education is provided, it's mandatory by the government, K through 6, 6th grade education. But again, that doesn't necessarily mean that all children are being educated. Another expansion, though, comes through voting rights, right? The middle class men, again, primarily are saying, hey, why should we not have the right to vote, right? Because at that point, voting rights were very much limited to the upper classes. So the middle class men got together and said, hey, wait a minute, especially in laws that concern us, that deal with industry, for example, we ought to have a say in how, people who own their estates and don't work for a living, shouldn't have a say in, interstate commerce, for example, or not interstate, but international commerce or business and things of that nature. So we get universal male suffrage that comes out of this industrial age as well, as these middle class men, advocate and get the right to vote. We know that women's voting rights and the suffragette movement, which we'll talk about a little bit later, the idea of women's suffrage certainly comes about during this era, but it is much slower to progress, and it's not until after the First World War that it comes to fruition. So for right now, we have universal male suffrage only, which again is a step in the right direction, but is not the same thing as universal suffrage, where both men and women have the right to vote. Public health. A moment ago, I mentioned, that we have the advent of some cures for some diseases, and the food supplies are better, and people are living longer, and that is certainly true. But we also know that due to the overcrowding of the cities and the tenement housing and things of this nature, we also had many epidemics, outbreaks of communicable diseases, and particularly striking, of course, to the poorer peoples who are living in these close living conditions and living with poor sanitation or no sanitation, and living in the tenement houses and so forth, are certainly more prone to have public health issues. And then these epidemics like cholera, tuberculosis, etc., tend to run rampant through these lower income communities, thanks in part due to the tenement housing. All right, so here we have a map of Western Europe, which was the part of Europe that was mostly industrialized. So if it's not on the map, there might be some industrialization in places like Eastern Europe and Russia, which are off, to the right-hand side of the map. As you can see, Italy, for example, the northern part of Italy, very highly industrialized, but if you went down the boot, which again is off the map, you wouldn't see a lot of industrialization. And so in some ways, we can talk about it in Marxist terms, the haves and the have-nots, who has the industrialization and who doesn't. And this map does a good job sort of demonstrating that, not just by what's here on the map, but what is not on the map. You also can see here on the map, that many different major cities, and the fact that they have either iron or linens or cottons or textiles, which are your basic, starting raw materials that are necessary for industrialization. You also see where the railroads are, right? And the railroads, are very plentiful, certainly in the British Isles, as you can see. When you get to continental Europe, they're a little bit more spread out. And some of them are interconnected, but many of them are not. And so we don't have a continental-wide railroad system here, which means, doing business across countries could be tricky sometimes, because you might be able to transport your goods from one place to another via railroad, but they might not be able to go all the way to the place you wanted to go. So you may have to then arrange for, some sort of transport through the land or through water to sort of coordinate with that to get it to the next leg of your journey, so to speak. So this map gives you some sense of, at least in Europe, what industrialization was like. So next we're going to talk about the political changes. So far we've talked about the technological changes and some of the new inventions of the Industrial Revolution and the turn of the century, and then we just talked about some of the societal changes. Now we're going to talk about these political changes and what we call the decline of the old order. So what was the old order? Well, the old order is monarchies, essentially, hereditary monarchies, right? And so this is this idea of the divine right of kings, right? And so the Bourbon dynasty is destined to rule over the French people, and the Habsburgs are destined to rule over the Austrians, and the Romanovs over the Russians, right? And power is inherited by the eldest son and the eldest son, and so on and so on and so forth. Now, there have been many places in Europe that had already experimented with different types of governments where monarchies were already being challenged. But add to the mix of all of those things, add to the mix of that these newly elected or newly able to vote men, mostly of the middle class, and they're the ones who start to say, well, hey, wait a minute, why is that the case? Right? So on the one hand, you have these middle class men and working class people who are going to challenge this old order of the monarchy, and then you're going to have the wealthy, mostly landowning aristocracy trying to hold on to the monarchy and supporting the monarchy because, of course, their power and their wealth is aligned with the monarchy, so to speak. So when we talk about liberalism and conservatism in this period of time, the liberals are those that are challenging hereditary monarchy, and the conservatives are those that are trying to hold on to it. We also have the advent, not surprisingly, of socialism that develops in 1848 in Germany by two German men, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, of course, who in 1848 publish the Communist Manifesto. And this is not just about challenging the old order of things, but it's also about challenging the old order of things politically and economically, right? Engels in particular I find very fascinating because he was someone whom benefited from the sort of old new order, if you will, right? He comes from a factory owning family. And so his father had owned a factory, or several factories, in fact. And he could have very easily, if just said, okay, I'm next in line. When my father dies, I'm going to learn to run the factory, and I'm going to inherit the factory, and I'm going to just do what he did, and so on and so forth, right? And live very comfortably doing so. So he's part old money, part new money in that sense that, he was definitely someone who was very wealthy, who was used to sort of creature comforts and things that went along with it, could have absolutely have, you know, could have absolutely have just sat back and benefited from the system, but instead he's one of those rare individuals who says, no, I don't like the way things are, right? I see the conditions in which my workers are working. I see the conditions in which they live, what they go home to at the end of the day, and it shouldn't be that way, right? That there's plenty of wealth, there's plenty of resources to go around the whole world over, and if we, have this idea of equal distribution of wealth, then no one would ever have to be poor or hungry again, right? And so in some ways it's very optimistic in the sense that it's saying, look at everyone, we can just share the wealth, and everyone gets, to have a basic standard of living, a decent standard of living, and that everyone should have this sort of equality. So in theory, it's not a bad idea, right? So they publish this Communist Manifesto, and they certainly find a following with, many workers who by this time are, quite upset about being exploited. And again, the tenement housing and the living conditions that they live in, and the barely getting by, no access to health care and things of that nature, little access to any sorts of rights and things of that matter, living in crime-infested neighborhoods, all of the things that we associate with uh, slums, poor neighborhoods, etc. certainly, seem to flock to this idea, right, of communism and or socialism. So, it's important to note that in the 1800s, it is mostly just a intellectual idea. It's something that is, gaining some popularity, but it isn't extremely popular. And certainly, the people who would be worried about some of the things that Marx and Engels write about in the Communist Manifesto would be the upper and the middle classes, because it does call for a worldwide revolution and the workers of the world uniting and overthrowing the bourgeoisie or the wealthy folks, and so it does have this sort of Robin Hoodness about it, rob from the rich to give to the poor, so to speak. But after that, you usher in this classless society, which is supposed to be a more sort of utopian idea of having equality for others. So there are many different types of socialists, right? And not all of them necessarily believe in the type of socialism that gets practiced in communist countries, right? So that's where it gets a little murky. We did have eventually, again, in the early 1900s, we start to see in many countries socialist parties forming as legitimate political parties. And so they're not necessarily calling for revolution in this sense. They're certainly not necessarily calling for revolution in terms of a worldwide revolution. And they're not necessarily calling for a change in government. They just want to implement some of these socialist ideas of equality through the government systems that already exist. So, for example, we have in France a man by the name of Jean Jaurès, who is a member of the French Parliament, and he is openly a socialist, right? And is a member of the French Parliament, so he is a legitimate socialist, as they say. He's not calling for revolution, but he's trying to urge the government in which he's a part of to pass legislation that would bring about, some things like workers' rights and some more fairness to society, social welfare programs, and things like that. And then, of course, there are, the radical socialists like Vladimir Lenin of Russia, who by 1900 has been exiled by the Tsar for his revolutionary ideas, and is absolutely calling for, this worldwide revolution. So here in the 1800s, though, we really just see sort of the beginning stages of either of those types of socialist ideas. Certainly, they challenge the old order of things, though. So in the last slide, we talked about the decline of the old order in terms of ideologies, that within countries, as well as sort of this worldwide view of the world, are challenging monarchy as monarchy being the old order. Now we're going to talk about the old order, not just about within countries themselves, but how those European countries relate to each other and how empires relate to each other. And so we're going to talk about nationalism as a dividing force as well as a unifying force. So nationalism as a unifying force in the run-up to the 1900, we see the unification of Germany and Italy, who both by that time, until the 1870s, had been a series of sort of regional princedoms or city-states, if you will, and which, there wasn't Germany per se. We talk about Prussia, we talk about the Prussian army, but they were only one portion of what becomes Germany. Italy, likewise, we know that Rome, of course, was the seat of power of the Catholic Church, and there are many different ethnicities that make up the Italian people, as there are ethnicities that make up the German people. And Venice and Florence were two major powers during previous centuries, but had lost some power. But these peoples got together and said, okay, we want this one national identity, Italy, right? And so mostly through war and through revolution, in both cases, in both Germany and Italy, we see this come to fruition. In Germany particularly, Otto von Bismarck, who was the Chancellor of Germany, he was the head of Prussia, and he's the one that kind of gets the ball rolling and says, okay, Germany had tried to unify for many years and had failed, and he's the one that says, okay, well, if Germany is bound to unify, then he wanted to make sure he did that. And that Prussia was at the head of power, and so he does it through war. He figures the quickest way to unify people is to find a common enemy, and so he launches several wars, the last of which being the Franco-Prussian War, the war against France in 1870, and that kind of sealed the deal for a unified Germany. All right. We can also talk about nationalism in a way that sometimes we don't think of when we think of the roots of the Russian Revolution. We don't necessarily think of it as being nationalistic. Of course, we think of it as being socialism, and certainly socialism is part of that. But there were many grievances of the Russian people against their czars. Several czars before the last one, Nicholas II, right? So in the 1880s, we know that Alexander II, who was Nicholas's grandfather, he is assassinated because he tries to make reforms so that Russia would be very similar to or more like some of the other monarchies of Europe who by this time had adopted more limitations on their power. He is known for freeing the serfs, which got rid of that type of economy, and so certainly that made him popular amongst the lower classes, but not so popular amongst the upper classes. So then, after his father, of course, is assassinated, Alexander III assumes the throne in 1881, as the PowerPoint suggests. Those are his reign dates, not his birth and death dates, although 1894 is also his death date. And, seeing the violence and having lost a father at quite a young age, and having, feeling upset, certainly, at the loss of a father influences Alexander III's reign. He undoes many of the reforms of his father because he felt like, that the people betrayed him. And so he reverts back to a very autocratic type of government. His son, Nicholas II, the last Tsar of Russia, will inherit the throne upon his death in the 1890s. And he's really unprepared for the job. It's a job that he has not wanted. He's shied away from his whole life. He doesn't want to do it. But such is the nature of the hereditary monarchy. We know that early in his reign, he is plagued by the fact that he cannot produce a male heir. He has 4 daughters. This is problematic. At the time, there was a law in Russia that said no females could inherit the throne, dating back to the son of Catherine the Great. And Nicholas certainly toyed with the idea of changing that law so that his eldest daughter, Olga, could inherit the throne. But eventually, they do manage to have a 5th child, the Tsarevich, Alexei, who is born, who unfortunately is born with hemophilia. And this influences the type of ruler that Nicholas is in many ways, because the idea that the ruler of a country, his heir might die at any given point based on this, physical disease that he has, um, would have been seen as a huge, huge um, negative. So they hide this from the public. But what that ends up doing is that shields this royal family from the public, and they, um, so there's this sense that um, Nicholas and his family are sort of out of touch with the reality of his people, and in many ways they were. And there are revolts in the street, there are revolutions, and as a result of that, Nicholas creates the Duma, or legislative branch, in 1905. Um, to try to give the people some of what they want, saying, okay, look, you have now a legislative branch of government that will, at least on paper, give you some rights and some say in the government. But the reality was that the Duma was not a legislative branch of government in what we think of as a check and balance on the executive branch's power, but it was more of an advisory board. And it would advise the Tsar of what they thought they should do in terms of running the country or running the war against Japan first, and then later World War I. But in reality, he did what he thought was best, and he often did not do what the Duma suggested that he should do. So there's a lot of tension in Russia at the turn of the century. Around the Tsar and the Tsar's power, and the idea of revolution is certainly there, with or without the communist. So, which way the revolution is going to go is definitely something that was not a foregone conclusion. So, the decline of the old order in the balance of power in Europe is also shifted with nationalism, when we talk about nationalism, particularly as a dividing force. So we've talked about how it could unify people, like it did in Germany and Italy, where they have a common language and they have a common culture, and they get together and they form the nation state, right? But in places like these major empires, like Russia, who's home to 1/6 of the world's population, for example, and is home to many different ethnicities other than Russian, right? You might see some of those nationalities want to break away. That didn't actually happen so much in Russia, but it does happen to some of Russia's neighbors, the Ottoman Empire, and particularly in the Balkan states, the Balkan Peninsula, as well as Austria-Hungary. So the Ottoman Empire is the last bastion of Muslim empires in Europe, and that goes back to about the 1200s. And by the 1800s, it encompasses parts of Europe, parts of Northern Africa, much of what today we call the Middle East, and it's run by the Ottoman Turks of what is modern-day Turkey. And they have, sultans instead of kings, but they have sort of the same idea that, the eldest son inherits the throne from the eldest son, and it is a monarchy. And they're home to many different ethnicities, and as PowerPoint shows you, that in the early to mid 1800s, we see a lot of individual ethnic groups that were part of the Ottoman Empire breaking free and declaring their independence. And so, in the sense of the Ottoman Empire, all of these countries or these peoples who break away and declare their independence and get their independence is then a dividing force, because they no longer see themselves as part of this larger entity, this empire. this changes the balance of power in Europe. When we talk about the balance of power in Europe, we talk about the idea that, generally speaking, all of the European powers had relatively the same technology. They had pretty evenly matched armies and navies. I mean, some were slightly better than others, like Britain has the most powerful navy, right? But their army isn't necessarily as good as Germany's, right? So, but generally speaking, they all had roughly about the same amount of power in terms of their military might. And so they had, relatively peaceful with each other. Particularly in the late 1800s, they were relatively at peace with each other. They weren't fighting each other as often, and so that kept the balance of power. Bismarck of Germany, in particular, always said that Germany should always stay in some sort of alliance system and be in a alliance with at least two other major powers of Europe, so they would have a majority of three. And so he was always keenly aware of that. He tried to keep that balance of power. But when we have, the rise of Germany, the rise of Italy as nation states, when we have, Russia kind of having a lot of internal issues, when we have the Ottomans who are having these countries break apart from them, and then Austria-Hungary as well, one of the other five major powers of Europe, is experiencing similar situations in the Balkan region, where people of Slavic nationalities are trying to break free. That also is an Austria-Hungary trying desperately to hold on to that power and not allowing some of these countries to break free, certainly can upset the balance of power in Europe. And so you see these sort of growing tensions towards the end of the century and right around 1900 in the run-up again in the 14 years before World War I begins. You see some of this imbalance of power, or this changing of power. In Latin America, which of course is not in Europe, we see the colonial governments established by Spain in several different places being also overthrown in Mexico, Chile, and Argentina, respectively. And very similar to our own revolutions, our own revolution, singular, sorry, in the United States, these were folks who, start to see themselves less as Spanish and more as Mexicans, Chileans, Argentinians. They start to identify more with where they are versus where they originally, or where their parents or grandparents, several generations in many cases have come from. And so you start to see these colonial governments overthrown in Latin America, and the establishment of new governments there as well. Another thing that challenges the old order of things, where Europe is the prime place for wealth, since the 1700s had really established itself as the dominant region in the world by and large. With the advent of industrialization in North America, in the United States and Canada particularly, and as the United States becomes not necessarily a military power, but an economic power, this essentially puts Europe on notice and says, hey, we might not be able to challenge you, or be willing to challenge you, wanting to challenge you militarily, but absolutely we will challenge you economically. And so that represents certainly a shakeup of things, so to speak, in terms of the old order. So far we've talked about the Industrial Revolution and the technological, social, and political changes that came about thanks to the Industrial Revolution. Now we're going to focus a little bit more on the intellectual and cultural things. So first we're going to take a look at Albert Einstein, Max Planck, and others who come around again right at the turn of the century. They're doing all sorts of explorations, and particularly in the world of physics, which, as you may or may not know, that dating back to the Enlightenment, we had Newton and Newtonian physics and the laws that he gave us, which were the foundation by which pretty much all other physics took shape. Einstein in particular starts challenging that idea, particularly with his, again, as I say, the theory of relativity, in which he talks about time. So I have a cute little clip from the internet that we're going to watch that kind of explains the theory of relativity sort of in a layman's terms, if you will. So let's take a look. All right, we're back. So if you didn't like that clip so much, it's okay. Another way to think about relativity is a story that I heard a long time ago, and I'll share with you now. It's a story about how Einstein, upon meeting Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States, when he immigrates to the United States, he's given the chance to meet President Roosevelt, as you well know. He is the one that first suggested, the technology, the physics behind the splitting of atoms and possible development of the atom bomb. But their first meeting, two men meet each other, and he says, President Roosevelt says to Einstein, I'm a pretty smart man, but I just don't quite get this whole relativity thing. Can you, explain it to me pretty simple? And Einstein, who was known for his good humor, said, well, take a minute. It's a constant, right? It's 60 seconds. That doesn't change no matter where you are in the world or what you're doing. But the theory of relativity, my theory of relativity says that that's not necessarily so. That 60 seconds will be experienced very different, for example, if you are in the presence of a pretty girl versus having your hand on a hot stove. That 60 seconds in the presence of a pretty girl will go by very, very fast, and that same 60 seconds with your hand on a hot stove will go by very, very slow. And in his, sort of tongue-in-cheek way, he was basically saying that even though time is technically supposed to be constant, that the way that we experience that time is relative to our own experiences, right? So you all here, sitting here listening to this lecture, may be experiencing time very slowly. Wish I would get on with things already, right? Or you just love what I'm saying and you're eating it up and you just wish you could stay here forever listening to me. Yeah, I know. Not true, right? But that's the idea in a very simplistic way of looking at things. We also have Freud and psychoanalysis and the idea of the subconscious or the unconscious mind, which also challenges the old order in terms, again, as the way that we think about the world. Europeans in particular, after the period of the Enlightenment, have prided themselves on the fact that they are individual beings and they can think freely. I think, therefore I am, right? And this, determines intellect is very important, and those sorts of ideas, which of course gives rise to things like democracy and religious tolerance and all sorts of quote unquote enlightened ideas, right? Well, Freud and his belief in the unconscious mind challenges that because he says, look at yes, human beings, generally speaking, will think through a problem and come up with the best solution that generally is for the greater good, and that's how progress is done. But sometimes we do things and we don't know why we do things, and that there's something buried deep within us that we're unaware of, that makes us act in a certain way or say a certain thing or do a certain thing. And he says that that is what he would call the unconscious or the subconscious mind. And then that's more emotional. That instead of human beings being thinking and rational, but we sometimes act very emotionally and very irrationally. Um, and so certainly that challenges this Enlightenment view that Europeans certainly have of themselves, right? So these two men, and again, as many other thinkers of their day, a lot of the new science, whether it's hard science like physics or social science like psychology, right? They challenge the old order of things in the intellectual realm because it challenges human beings to think differently about ourselves. So last but not least, literature and the arts. As previously mentioned, literature generally takes on a more realistic point of view. Many novelists become very socially active. In this country, we're familiar with the jungle and the exposition that does on the meatpacking industry leads to the creation of the FDA and government oversight programs and things of that nature. In Europe, we also have many novelists who are writing, in an effort to, through literature, through novels and through characters who aren't necessarily real, but they experience many of the similar things that other people are feeling. And so he wrote about, for example, the coal mines and sort of the rough and tumble life of people living in the coal mines and the families that these coal miners come home to, and the types of lives that the hardships that go along with that life. He wrote about the slums. He wrote about life in, the not so nice neighborhoods where people are packed in like sardines, the tenement housing that we spoke of earlier. We looked at the Victorian slum house and things of that nature. So he, was someone who wrote in order to not just have people enjoy his novels, but to perhaps do something about the things that they saw in his novels. Conversely, again, as previously mentioned, art moves in the opposite direction, and it moves away from realistic paintings and going to more abstract paintings. Impressionism is the type of painting that we first kind of see, and again, at the later part of the 1900s and into the early part of the 1900s. Monet, of course, is probably the most famous, although not necessarily the most important, just the one that I chose because you're probably familiar with some of his works. Even if you don't realize it, you'll probably recognize these. But Impressionism really, it's about the interplay of light and shadows to, sort of express something. So the next two paintings that you see, the water lilies here on the right-hand side of the screen and La Promenade on the left demonstrates, that there's a certain amount of interpretation that goes into when you look at these paintings. Particularly, I think the Promenade on the left, you could interpret several ways. Obviously there's a woman and a child, and they're out for a walk or a stroll, and she's carrying some sort of parasol to shade her face and her skin from the light so she doesn't get sunburned. The child has a hat on, presumably for the same purpose. They seemingly are well dressed, and so you can make some inferences about who they are and what their deal is, but that can be subject to obviously interpretation based on your own experiences. And that's part of what Impressionism was about, was kind of just experiencing the art and looking at it and then interpreting it in the ways that perhaps the painters didn't necessarily intend for you to interpret them. Water lilies, of course, on the right, don't necessarily represent a pictorial version of what an actual lily pond looks like, but again, more in the abstract. And you can see particularly the lights and the shadows between those two. From there, we move on to Expressionism. Expressionism takes distorted images and shapes as well as different colors to try to represent something, right? We looked at the beginning, we looked at the Scream, Edvard Munch's painting, which of course certainly looked at used the distorted shapes. Van Gogh's Starry Night certainly not only invokes different shapes, right? Distorted shapes. It's not a realistic representation per se of, if you took a photograph of the sky. But it also uses the color blue, obviously, as the dominant color, and blue can invoke certain different emotions. So some interpretations of the painting are, that it's very calm, blue's a calming color, and, this is a very sleepy town, it's nighttime, and there's a sort of calmness about, looking at this very peaceful night sky. And blue also, sometimes is associated with sadness. And so, some people say, oh, maybe, Van Gogh was suffering from depression at the time that he painted this, and yes, he was. We now know that that is the case. But is there a certain sadness to this painting? Maybe. A lot of, again, it's difficult to say, but sometimes, right? This dark part over here might represent something quite different. It seems somewhat out of place in the rest of the painting. What does that mean? There are, again, a number of interpretations. You feel free to, disagree with all of them or whatever. It's left up to you. But some things that people also notice is the church in the middle of the painting as well. Is Van Gogh trying to say something about the place of religion? Who knows, right? But these are some different interpretations that we get. Well, certainly we can see, though, that we have a dominant color that might mean something. We have distorted shapes that might mean something. Next, we have Ludwig Meidner's Apocalyptic Landscape, also an Impressionist painting. Also depicts, what used to be a town, but of course is destroyed by this apocalyptic sort of vision he has. And so you might certainly interpret that as, being very pessimistic, focusing more on the despair versus the hope, right? You might interpret that as, some Meidner being someone who, clearly thought that things were not so rosy, not so happy, right? I like to look at them side by side, which is this next slide here, where you can see Van Gogh's Starry Night next to Meidner's Apocalyptic Ruin. And I often, say, or I think, and again, feel free to, this is my opinion, but I often think that this is kind of the before and after of World War I, even though both paintings were painted before World War I, right? I think that, you could say, okay, this is sort of the innocence on the right, the calm, the sereneness of the town, and then, on the left, and then on the right, the death and destruction that we see after World War II. Or World War I. Well, World War II too, but World War I specifically. Last but not least, we have the movement of Cubism, which was first painted and began by Pablo Picasso, who, of course, was a Spanish painter who mostly painted in France, um, and Braque, who was another Cubist painter. Cubism is this idea of trying to take the three-dimensional and then showing it in the 2D, looking at things from every perspective that you can look at it, and then trying to show all of those perspectives within the two-dimensionality of it. So his self-portrait on the left there is, is a sort of rudimentary cubist painting in the sense that it's not necessarily trying to show all aspects or perspectives of Picasso, the person. You're obviously just looking at him from the one side, but you can see how it kind of has this, very hard line sort of approach to it. The one on the right hand side of the screen is, I didn't put the title on it on purpose because but it was painted in 1913, and I wanted you to think about yourself, think about some of the different shapes you see within the painting and what sort of three-dimensional object or objects you think you might see in there. And then obviously the title of the painting gives it away, so that's why I purposely didn't put the title of the painting here. But within once you figure out, okay, that this is a certain thing that you might look at in whatever 3D object or objects he was trying to paint, then you kind of get a sense of the different perspectives of that object. That clearly this is not, again, a mirror image representation or something like that of those objects. I'll give you a hint, it's two different objects. All right, we're going to pause and so you can think about that, and then I'll come back and give you the answer. All right, so the name of the painting is Violin and Guitar, right? And so now we can think about, there's the f-stop that you see, right? You can see kind of the shape of either a violin or guitar, both have kind of this curvy-like shape. You can see some of the intricacy workings of, this here's the violin strings because it's 4 strings, guitar usually has 6, right? So 4 strings must be the violin. You can see the top portion of a stringed instrument here, this little curlicue. Lots of different things that once you, again, figure out that it is a stringed instrument or instruments, particularly violin and guitar, then I think it's a pretty easy, I think, to see, than some of these paintings. All right, so that's it for today. So just to sum up, we have talked about the Industrial Revolution, why it began in Europe, some of the social political changes that came about thanks to the Industrial Revolution, particularly the upset of the balance of power in Europe in the run-up to World War I, people calling for social change and challenging the old order. And then we looked at these intellectual movements in particular. We looked at Einstein's theory of relativity and psychoanalysis by Freud and Emile Zola and his particular literary works. And then we looked at the Impressionist, Expressionist, and Cubist painters. Have a great day!